Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Hope you had
Hello.
a chance to stretch your legs. And thank you, Carina, and your euphonium team for a great warm-up session. That was really great. And I want to say hello to Lise Vaugeois. Hi, Lise. And Carina is joining us. And Carina and I are going to be having a discussion with Lise in a few minutes. First thing I wanted to say was, so this session is kind of a heavy topic. We're going to be talking about the history and legacy of systemic racism in the Canadian music industry. And I just wanted to mention, we're going to use Glenn Singleton's Courageous Conversations About Race protocols, which are to stay engaged. We may expect discomfort. We expect and accept non-closure, and everyone speaks their truth. So with that said, I also wanted to thank everyone who submitted questions in the questionnaire for ideas and topics for discussion, and we will try to get to as many of those questions as we can today. And Carina, I'll pass it over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Jessie. Yes, so to echo Jessie, thank you so much for pre-submitting those questions in the survey that we had posted in advance. So we do recognize that, you know, within this 1 hour long session, our objective is to raise awareness and educate. It's a broad topic, but we'll do what we can. And if there are questions that are left unanswered, rest assured that this is a commitment of our collective to have this discussion continue on. So if it's not answered in this particular session, we will commit to actually getting that answered at some point in the future. Another thing to highlight is the fact that the Canadian Women's Brass Collective, we are a collective, and so we are not associated with any organization. So whatever we put out and share today really is just to help inform. We're not in any position to implement policies with other organizations, and we're just really hoping to create a clearer path to support all musicians and help everyone thrive. So back to Jessie.
Great, thank you, Carina. So I'd like now to introduce our special guest. It's Dr. Lise Vaugeois. Now, I met Lise in the early 2000s in the Thunder Bay Symphony. And Lise and I played together in the horn section. And we played a lot of the classical repertoire together. And we had some really good times on tour with the symphony. And we also, well, Lise is not only a great horn player, but she also is an amazing paddler and kayak instructor, and she knows a lot about the Great White North. So when I was there, she introduced me to lots of different hikes. I remember that Silver Falls hike Lise told me about. That was really gorgeous. I did that hike many, many times when I lived there. So before we jump into the topic, just wanted to give a little background about Lise. So Lise is a composer. She's an educator. She conducts a men's choir. Well, not right now because of the pandemic, but in normal times, she's a music director. They're called the Gentlemen of Harmony. Lise she teaches at Lakehead University right now, and she has a PhD in philosophy of music education. So we are so thrilled that Lise is here to talk with us about this and this topic. So welcome, Lise.
Thanks, Jessie.
Thank you for being here. Is there anything you wanted to say off the top right now?
Yeah, well, so I'm going to, this is an introduction. We're going to have an introduction, and there'll be lots of gaps, and I will say things that, you know, I don't have time to provide all the literature and back it up, say why I'm making particular statements. And the goal is we are trying to educate ourselves And a lot of what I'm going to talk about today may be quite new to many of you. And that is really because when we start to talk about systemic racism, systemic factors, we will start to see that education, culture, the way that national identities are marketed, let's say, or told to us, all of these things contribute to our understandings of ourselves as Canadians or as immigrants to this country. But we're missing a lot of information. And that's not accidental that we don't have that information. We actually have to work pretty hard to put all the different pieces together. So yeah, I just ask for people to be open and curious. And I have sent along a resource list. And I will say that so I left the Thunder Bay Symphony in 2006 to do the PhD. And when I wrote the dissertation was really meant for us, for those of us who actually trained in Canadian schools to become professional musicians. So,
Can I share the title of your dissertation, Lise?
Sure, yeah.
It is Colonialization and the Institutionalization of Hierarchies in the Human Throughout Music Education, Studies in the Education of Feeling. That's a very interesting topic to do your dissertation in.
And it was really interesting. And I wish I could publish it, but in fact, it's freely available to everybody. And
how would people read that if they wanted to read it?
I've sent a link on the. Did you get the file I sent?
Yes. Okay. Yeah, so we'll post all the resources that you sent. We'll post it in our on our website after our conversation.
Yeah, it's super easy to get. U of T has got something called a thesis portal. You can download it, and as they say, it's free. So all you need is access to a university library, which not everybody has, but you can also send me an email and I'll send it to you. Right.
Great.
Yeah. So, okay, that's a starting place. And maybe I'll just say one other thing before you ask me we launch into the questions. And that is that difference is not the problem. Okay. Often we are told, given the idea that, it's because we're not familiar enough with other cultures. We just don't understand other cultures, and we're kind of fearful of other cultures. And so we just need to get to know each other better, and then all of these problems will go away. And what I want to say is that difference is not the problem. It's the political uses of difference that creates a hierarchy of who counts. And those political uses of differences are what we have to figure out. It's great to learn more about other cultures. It's not like that's not a wonderful thing, but that's not the crux of the problem.
All right, so we'll segue into the first question of the day. Lise, can you tell us a little bit about what colonization and colonialism is, and what is the role of culture in the colonial process?
Okay, I'll start with the first part, come back to culture later. So first, I'd like everybody to park all of your ideas about what you've learned about colonization, because in school we learn a lot of heroic narratives and the struggle to overcome the wilderness and overcome this cold climate and all of this, and it's all very heroic. But colonization is something quite different from what we've been taught. Now, I have a definition here. Colonization or colonialism is the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country, occupying it with settlers, and exploiting it economically. So think back to why monarchs and later governments invested so much money in sending people around the world, sending explorers around the world. What were they after? They were looking for wealth, right? They were looking for resources, different ways to accumulate wealth. The explorers were also interested in accumulating wealth and fame and adventure, right? But really, Canada was set up to send goods and profits back to European investors. That's why it was created. And you have this process going on all over the world. At a certain point, Britain actually had control over 80% of the globe. Very interesting. But you can also appreciate that peoples around the world did not want to be controlled by Britain or by anybody else. And so you had resistance movements, some of which were successful, or at least successful to a degree. Now in Canada, and those colonial setups were different in every place, but similar in every place, in that the goal was always to harness resources and, if possible, harness the labor of the population. Now in Canada, the specific situation is that when explorers came here, the fur trade was the first economic opportunity to develop. And the only way to do that was to work together with Indigenous peoples. That's how they learned how to survive. But also the whole economy of the fur trade depended on those interactions with Indigenous peoples. And in fact, intermarriage was strongly encouraged because that is how the relationships were created. So in Indigenous culture, relationships are extremely important, and women were very important to the fur trade. So, but the fur trade dries up for various reasons, and Europeans then are looking to exploit other resources. And in order to do that, and in order to hang on to the land mass and not let some other European nation or the Americans get it, it's important to populate as much of the land mass as possible, hence the need for settlers. So settlers are brought over in a variety of capacities. So you have to think about what was going on in Europe that so many people wanted to leave and start from scratch somewhere else, and in fact start in the wilderness, in some other place. So things weren't very good in Europe for a lot of people. And they had a lot of different reasons for coming here. Some came as members of the management class. Some came hoping to, farm the land and set up homesteads. There were a lot of different reasons that people came for, and they were really experienced a lot of advertising, saying, come to Canada and we will give you 146 acres of free land, and if you farm it, you keep it. So there are always these sales tactics to make it seductive to come, right? So where was I? The reasons for populating the land are in order to access and exploit the resources and to lay claim to the land. Now they have a problem because there are Indigenous people living here, and they occupy lots of the land, and they have a different way of utilizing the land. So instead of seeking them out as marriage partners, now they're in the way, right? As soon as the white women are imported to the Red River settlement, things change really badly for Indigenous families. So the marriages that had been taken place no longer count. Only marriages within the church count now. And those are marriages between white people for the most part. And how do you justify taking away land from the people who are already here? Well, you justify it on the basis of racism, on the basis of the idea that the European subject is civilized and more advanced on the scale of evolution than the indigenous. And in fact, there's all kinds of scholarly work documenting how in things like the Chicago World's Fair and so on, where you've got the great tree of life, this evolutionary scale, where you've got white educated Europeans up here and down, and then different, I'm going to put races in quotation marks because race is a social construction. And then you go down that scale, and at the very bottom, you've got natives and black people. Okay, so what's the purpose of a scale like that? Except as a justification for who is going to rule over others, and to make a claim that it's natural, that this is a natural hierarchy. So you have race and racism actually at the very foundation of the Canadian state. And that is true of all white settler states. That's true of South Africa, New Zealand, the United States, Australia. So it's designed to be a white settler state. The hope is that these settlers will be loyal to their home country of origin. And in this part of the country, the hope is that they will be loyal to Britain. It's a little bit different in Quebec. So I focused my studies on English Canada and actually on Toronto in particular. So then what happens? So if we're thinking about an economic structure, then we get the importation of Chinese workers to build the railroads. Okay, so what happens when you have, let's call them temporary foreign workers, because we have those today. And that was the intent when the Chinese workers were brought over, that they wouldn't stay. So they come over, they're separated from their families, they're separated from home, which makes them vulnerable, right? Once you're here, you're going to accept whatever work is offered to you at whatever wages are offered to you. How does this help the people who own those businesses? Well, you've got a downward pressure on the cost of labor, right? And you've actually got a competition between the people who are already here and the newcomers who have fewer means of security. So they can be pitted against each other as opposed to being pitted against the ones who are actually profiting from the work. And so you've got one of the early instances of the temporary foreign worker, and Chinese men then were here. Many of them died. It was a very dangerous work, building the railroads. And then they weren't, they wanted to stay, and the only way they could stay was to pay the head tax, which was quite a lot of money at that time, in order to bring their families over. That pattern is repeated again and again. We get to the 70s, and that's when state multiculturalism gets introduced. Up until then, immigration is always purpose-oriented, I would say. And there was a lot of discrimination built into those immigration laws. So they did not want Black people here, although there have been Black people here for centuries. They wanted Europeans, and at one point they wanted East Europeans because they thought they'd be better farmers. So that's kind of the really brief overview of a structure that we fit into in all kinds of different ways, but that is dependent, has always been dependent on race as a way to divide people into categories of deserving and undeserving. And it also is a divide and conquer strategy. So I'm going to skip over, before we go to culture, just skip over to the United States and the plantations. You have in the plantations originally, you've got indentured servants coming from Europe, which means they have no rights at all. They've got to work off their passage. and you've got slaves coming from Africa. Initially, they are more or less on the same level with the same working conditions. And they start to organize, okay? They start to organize against the plantation owners. What are the plantation owners going to do to stop this? They split them apart. That is the time when Black becomes property. Black people become defined in law as property, and whiteness as a category, at least in that American context, gets defined as white, using the word white. You give one group of people a few more privileges over another group of people that's being treated like absolute dirt, and this group starts to invest in their superiority and their privileges over and above this group. So we see this again and again, and it's a form of power as seduction. I would say that this group gets seduced into believing that they're better than this group, more worthy, and they're offered the position of dominating this group, right? They might still be living in dirt shacks themselves, but they still get to supervise some of the Black slaves, which makes them better. You also see, in every colonial context, you see anti-miscegenation laws, which means they did not want a mixing of Europeans with natives, okay, whether it's people in India, Africa, China, Japan, wherever. They don't want that mixing. Why don't they want that mixing? Because the embodiments, the different embodiments, define who's entitled to rule, who is destined to be ruled over. As soon as you start mixing the so-called races together, those lines are blurred. And it's much more difficult to dehumanize the lower status group if you actually are having human relationships with them. So you'll see again and again processes that function to dehumanize particular groups of people in order to justify an unequal system, a hierarchical system in which many levels are exploited, but these divide and conquer tactics really wind up protecting those with the most power at the top. Okay, it's probably time to move into culture.
I had a question sort of based on what you were just saying, Lise. So if we think about that structure and then we apply it to, the music world, what are the roots of colonialism in forming classical music institutions? Like how did that form how music institutions became?
Right. And that is super interesting, at least I think it is. And if you go back a bit to the Industrial Revolution in Europe, so musicians were employed by members of the aristocracy. So that's one hierarchy and one form of governance. As things shift, musicians are kind of cut loose. So they try to become entrepreneurs, but within the new capitalist economy, they're still not necessarily very high up in the hierarchy. One writer refers to that the world of classical music as a dominated group within a dominant class. So you've got people coming from Europe, musicians and different kinds of artists coming here. And they really want to have culture. They want to be artists. They want to be musicians. They feel like they imagine themselves to be in a place that is new. It's young, right? That's part of our mythology, and that culture develops out of nothing. And there's always a feeling of being second best relative to Europe or later relative to the United States. Now, there were individual activities. There was also a lot of government money put into establishing cultural institutions. So if you think of somebody like Sir Ernest Macmillan, who was very much a supporter of the British Empire. So you've got people coming here. Some may or may not love the British Empire, but for the most part, that's the reason they're here, as part of the British Empire. And so there's lots and lots of, I'm going to call it propaganda, or you could call it advertising, to really say what's so great about the British Empire. We're bringing civilization to the far corners of the earth. We're casting out darkness and bringing the light to these primitive places. So establishing concert spaces, establishing music schools, establishing competitions across the country, all of these things are meant to serve a few purposes. And one of the main purposes is to establish entitlement, the sense of ownership in the new place. I'm just going to look and see if I've got a good quote. Yeah, the invention of culture. So the whole concept of culture doesn't even exist in the way that we know it today until all of these colonizing projects take place. And it becomes a way to compare the knowledge and habits and arts of the colonizing group versus the colonized groups. And so the whole concept of culture, as we know it today, evolves out of that desire to set the colonizing group above everybody else. And ultimately, then, you know, classical music is designed to represent the middle and upper middle classes. And it's designed to represent the whiteness of those classes. So you have schools, you've got, in the early periods, you've got grammar schools and you've got ladies' schools. And if you went to either of those schools, you learned classical music, you learned a canon of literature, and all of these things were supposed to be the soul, nurturing the soul. In these spaces, you also learned comportment, how to stand, how to dress, how to speak. You could talk about these topics, these sophisticated topics, in a sophisticated way. All of these things distinguished you from lower class members of the same society and marked you as civilized. Every institution that was established in some respects to ground the newcomers in the new world. Only it's not a new world. So in the landmass that we'll call Canada, all of those institutions were intended to normalize and ground the presence of the settlers. And it's very much a class-based project. So the contests across the country are intended to teach people what counts as culture, what counts as being valuable. So you might have, you know, across the country, you've got people who've come from all over the place, lots of different European countries, and they might not have very much in common with each other. We have to remember also that whiteness is an invention, right? Like, what is a white person except a Heinz 57 of a lot of different European roots. It's not really real. It's only real because it became real politically. Okay, it's a political construction that has come to be extremely powerful. And it's also a way of getting people to identify across class. So you might not have very many resources. You might have a lot of resources. In fact, you might be controlling a lot of the opportunities available to this person down here. And this person might decide to rebel against you. Okay, I'm going to fight back. I want you to stop controlling me. But sorry, I lost my train there. Right. And then let's say you bring in, okay, we're going to bring in Black workers now. They're going to come here as scabs. Well, they're desperate, right? They're even more desperate for work. So here's the white workers constructed as white. Here's the Black workers racialized as Black, pitted against each other. And what frequently happens is that white panic is evoked. So a race loyalty is evoked so that this group feels more connection to this group up here than they do to this group here, even though they have far more in common economically and politically with this group here. Okay, so having this thing called whiteness in the white race is very important for creating a sense of identity that somehow washes away those class differences to give the illusion that you're a part of the same team. And that's a lot of what the propaganda of empire was about, and the music of empire is to pull everybody into the same project, even though they're positioned very differently within that project. So yeah, so you've got the education, in public education, they were not learning classical music, and they were learning to be patriotic and to take up their place in whatever the new economy was going to be. But they were not initially intended to be leaders. Leaders were being produced out of those upper middle class schools, if you could afford to send your kids there. The conservatory starts in 1886, the Women's Musical Club and the Arts and Letters Club, all within 10 years of each other. And they are all colonial institutions. Still with us, right? I had a scholarship from the Women's Musical Club. We were sponsored by them in Winnipeg to perform. Okay, sorry, Carina.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. So it sounds a lot like all of these systems that were put in place has really put an emphasis on creating the notion that there's significance to classical music. So I guess we've created some structures in place, and now in our entire music education system, we are trained to learn Western music theory and music notation and things like that, right? Yeah. And it's not to say those things are bad, okay? So when I'm talking about this, we're trying to notice how different things work, notice relations of power and the systems that hold particular relations in place. So when we learn Western music, we learn that this is supposed to be an autonomous art form. It's universal. It's almost a gift of God. It's at such a high level of culture. And it's supposed to be completely abstracted from politics and from political relations. And if that's changed in your education, that would be very interesting. It certainly wasn't part of mine. And we are taught that to serve the music, right? The music comes first. We listen to the voice of the composer. We listen to the voice of the conductor, and we accept those disciplines.
as a means to get to the best possible interpretations of this, of the greatness of this music. And I'm not saying it's not great, right? It's wonderful. It's challenging. It's intellectually stimulating. It's does so many things. But the context that it has been developed has been as a way to assert the justified dominance of European-based culture. And
so,
that's, yeah, sorry, go on.
I was just going to say, well, finish your thought, and then I will ask.
That's okay.
It's kind of related to that, but it's sort of shifting a bit. You know, we've heard the term systemic racism a lot lately, and I'm just curious if you can explain what that exact means, because, you know, we've heard people like the premier in Quebec saying it doesn't exist, and, you know, Commissioner RCMP denying its existence. So I'm wondering if you can share with us, what you think, break it down for us.
Yeah, okay. So you take the development of education. Okay, education is developed for the masses and for the upper classes in a specific colonial context. And so what counts as knowledge is what is included in that curriculum. And also the desired outcome, what are you educating people for, is part of that curriculum. So, and then there's also the invention of school music. What music is in that body of work? Well, there are all these songs for children, no syncopations, anything that represents some other culture is always modified kind of to fit into a particular very simplified framework. Now, in the meantime, the upper class students are learning classical, okay, but the kids in public schools are learning this other repertoire. This is, we're going back in time, right? But those school books, you would be amazed if you follow them from the 19th century up until maybe 10 years ago. In fact, a brand new music teaching textbook that I used this year still has the same problems, same pieces of music, same racist, I'm losing the word at the moment, but minstrelsy songs by Stephen Foster that I know them all. But if you start to look at, okay, where did these songs come from? Why are we still singing them? Actually, they're still there. It's very recent that people have done the work to challenge that repertoire. So I might have lost track of your question, right? Systemic racism. So what's in the curriculum? Who is there and who is not there? Who do you see, who you don't see? You don't see Indigenous peoples apart from their role in supporting Europeans. And the whole idea in the way, up until very recently, Indigenous history, if it was taught at all, was about disappearing Indians. Okay, and that's the way it's worked culturally as well. A lot of musicians got paid money in the 19th century and 20th century to go out to different communities and collect their music. And why are they collecting it? Because they think it's dying. So courts, the justice system, policing system. Policing was invented, comes directly out of the slave patrols. So we shouldn't be surprised that policing still targets Black people more than any other group of people, but they also target other racialized groups and especially Indigenous people. That's systemic racism. It's built into the history. It's built into the structure. It's built into the reasons that many groups of people do not trust the police, can't trust the police, even though for me, and probably you, Jessie, as white-looking people, you know, you're taught that the police are your friends. You should be able to trust them. But that is not true for other groups of people who have experienced a lot of violence or had their children taken away by the RCMP or by social workers. Social work is also another area. All of the areas that are related to the running of the Canadian state and the idea of what's considered normal and what's not considered normal. Now, in every case, so that's what's meant by systemic. Okay.
Yeah.
That those hierarchies are baked into the structures.
That makes sense.
So just want to be mindful of time and make sure that we have an opportunity to answer some questions that were pre-submitted. We did have a few questions about what is the role of allyship and how can allies better support their colleagues, their students, their friends, and positively contribute in this space.
Right. So I think ally is a really important word. Sometimes it gets contested too, but there's a difference between charity and solidarity. Charity is when you reach down, help somebody, but it doesn't actually change the status of either person. Solidarity is when you're trying to work together to accomplish the goals of the people who are being pushed down. And also when you recognize that actually your world might be better too if it wasn't built like this and it was more had more opportunities for cooperation. So partly it's a matter of educating ourselves. So for example, I can't know what your experience is, Carina, as a racialized person in this country. Okay, if you were were you born here?
Yes, I was born in Vancouver.
Okay, so Canadian born, and nevertheless othered in a number of contexts within Canada. So I can't know what your experience is. You know what your experience is. The fact that it's partly my privilege that I don't know. I don't know the experiences of Black musicians. I don't know the experiences of Indigenous musicians. I can learn a lot about it, but it's not my place to say what they are, or that, for example, if you were to say, I think I really felt like this was a racist incident, and I could say, oh, I don't see it like that way at all. I just don't get it. That's a problem, okay? Because the problem of privilege is that you don't know. You have no way of knowing. You don't know. You don't know that you don't even know that you don't know, if that makes sense. So part of the job to be an ally is to listen and to learn more. In the classical world, how can you be an ally? Well, you want to support students. You want to recognize that what they may be dealing with things that you didn't have to deal with. And you want to be helping to create space so that they've got somewhere to go. And that's not easy in a shrinking, in a world of constructed economic scarcity, right? It's difficult to find spaces for everyone to go. And then we talked a bit about, what about real life scenarios? So you're sitting in orchestra and you notice that the conductor always passes over a certain person or doesn't speak to them as if they were the section lead, for example. Are you going to pipe up and say, hey, Mr. or Ms. Conductor, you're not, you're doing the wrong thing here. That's probably not a good idea, because it's actually going to center out the person who was passed over, possibly put the person who spoke up at risk, and embarrass the director, right? So you need to be looking for other avenues to address those issues, and it might not be very easy to address. But if people are there for you outside of the rehearsal and providing support and actually validating your experience, what you often get is, oh, well, that's just, whatever, it's not a big deal. And then the person isn't validated, right? That the experience has not been recognized for what it is. And that's often as hurtful as the experience itself. People probably have other ideas. I guess the answer is that you need to be strategic. Think strategically. I think you wanted to talk about the idea of open or closed auditions as well. And
that was one thing we had discussed about trying to make orchestras more diverse, and we sort of discussed, some people argue that we should take the screen down, and some people argue we should keep the screen up.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
My thought is that we have the screens, which does give an opportunity to get past some of the bias. And some people would like to have screens right up to the very end. Screens are often taken away for the last round. So some people would like to have them go up all the way to the end. And let's say that students are getting the support they need to go to an audition, whatever their background, whatever their advantages or disadvantages, they're getting that support. Then you have at least somewhat of an even playing field. My worry is that if you hire on the basis of race, even though we've said, okay, Jessie and Carina, you are both equally brilliant players. That's been established, but we're going to hire Carina because we want to have a more diverse workforce in this orchestra. Carina is now, I think, permanently racialized as the person who was hired because she looked a bit different from the so-called norm. And I think that never leaves the person. So the person always has the question inside themselves: was I hired because I'm good, or was I hired because you can tick a box off? And the people around her are also always asking that question. That's my worry. I know that affirmative action has done some really important things, but I'm not sure. Yeah.
So that's, in other words, that's tokenism. Is that right, Lise?
It would be tokenism. Well, it could be tokenism. Yeah. It messes it. I'm just not sure that it solves the problem. Yeah. So, yeah, and people feel that they get hired as tokens, or they get accused of being the token, right? I have a friend who went to law school who was accused of being the token Indian. Well, she was brilliant, but she still never got past that kind of name calling. So that's my worry of deliberately, in that situation. Now you form your ensembles. Maybe you're looking for people you want to create something entirely new with a whole bunch of different people with different backgrounds. That could be really interesting, could still wind up being tokenistic, right? Okay, I'm going to have one of these and one of these and one of these. It's my menu of difference. Okay, we've ticked all the boxes. I hope everybody loves us. Like, it's hard. it's hard because we never get to step out of a system that was built on racism. It's constructed that way. And it's often a double bind.
So I have another question. It's like, we have, anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism. It's not new, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I'm just curious, like when we focus on anti-Black racism or anti-Indigenous racism, would there be any impact, like, and how does this impact other racialized groups?
Mm-hmm. I think that you'll find that all of the issues intersect in various ways. However, how things play out for individual groups of people is always different and quite specific. So I think I was talking to you about an anti-Black racism workshop I attended. And one of the women was speaking, explaining something. And in the meantime, in the chat, people had gone off and were talking about other forms of oppression. And they went quite far away from what she was talking about. And she called them out and she said, look, this is an instance of anti-Black racism right now, because you're not actually able to listen and stick with this without going off and doing your own thing somewhere else. So, and I think the situation for each racialized group is somewhat different. And it's important to try to learn those different experiences, to be open to hearing about those different experiences, and to recognize that they might not be exactly the same.
I have a question, Lise. So, a lot of large organizations like symphony orchestras and, big, large organizations are really, seems like there's a sense of urgency to really, do something right now in terms of, equity, diversity, inclusion. And I'm just curious, like, what do you think large organizations can do to create meaningful change, like right now, as opposed to just talking about it and saying, oh, yes, we're going to diversify or whatever? And like, what do you think, without just making a statement saying, we support Black Lives Matter movement or something? Like, what do you think large organizations can do, like an actionable thing they can do right now?
I think they can extend their education, but they also need to be thinking, are we extending this out of our own self-interest because we want to maintain our audiences, so we want to go to other schools that don't normally, for example, get classical music experiences? I think it's an exploration. I don't think there's actually an easy answer. Again, because most of these organizations are hierarchically structured, right? Your music director makes $1 million. The players get, and it goes down till you get the cleaners who get the, little bit, whatever's left over at the end. Thunder Bay is doing some interesting things. Sometimes the collaborations are interesting, and definitely the Thunder Bay Orchestra has collaborated with Cheyenne Havorka, who's a singer-songwriter and also a master's of education. So she's in the schools, teacher, and she's curated performances and brought in children who actually performing, brought in elders who were singing, brought in groups, professional groups who work together with the symphony. Those concerts have taken place on the reserve. So there's some possibilities for building bridges there. That what I still think, though, that all of us need to be educated enough to join those movements. So it's not just our work as musicians. When when Indigenous communities are trying to defend their land, and we think it has nothing to do with us, it does. Like, these things matter. So sure, the Thunder Bay Symphony can go and play on the reserve. Has that improved conditions on the reserve? Do they have running water now because we went and played there? Not necessarily. But did we help them when they were trying to get running water? Did we actually speak up and support what they were doing, what they were trying to get done politically? That might make a difference. So it's not that the bridge building isn't important. Sometimes that's a step on the way, right? It's hard to stand up and say, well, I support Indigenous rights if you don't know any Indigenous people, right? If you have no relationship. So those concerts do provide some opportunities for building relationships, which is really what it has to be about, I think, is building relationships and then figuring out, how can I act in solidarity with people who are really getting the shit end of the stick? And it's structural and it's deliberate, right? The conditions on reserves are deliberate, because the bottom line is the state and the corporations want the land and resources. That's it. That's always what it's about. Land, resources, and then racialized bodies for cheap labor. So there's all kinds of stuff going on that tends to be, because of the way we're educated and the way where we work, seem to be somewhere over there with nothing to do with us. But actually, they're all interconnected. Even when arts funding gets cut, it's interconnected, right, with what's the priority at the time. Who's going to be the winner? Who's going to be the loser?
Yeah. So we have a couple minutes left in our hour. Carina, did you have any other questions you wanted to ask Lise?
I feel like we tried really hard to address all the questions that were sent. We do have one question here. Lise, I'm not sure if you can shed light on this, but what is being done to diversify ownership of major record labels?
I can't address that. I don't know.
So that might be something that we have to explore in the future. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Looking for indie labels or supporting indie labels from groups that don't often get representation. Yeah. Sorry.
So I guess we just have 1 minute left with our time. I wanted to thank you so much, Lise, for taking the time to talk with us today. I also wanted to thank the people who wrote in and asked us questions. And like Carina said, I really hope that we have done a good job asking your questions and covering a variety of different things. And like Carina said at the beginning, or maybe it was Lise said, that this is just a beginning of a conversation that we hope will continue. And we're committed to continuing these conversations and, move it forward. So I think we are going to take another short break.
Yes. And at 3:30, we're going to have our third and final session of the day. I will be on that panel. We have a discussion panel to discuss, how to embrace racial equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I will be accompanied by Kathleen Griffiths, Vanessa Ng, and Michiko Singh. So we thank you so much for. Thank you, Lise. I've learned so much just sitting here and just absorbing everything. And, I myself, I feel like I have a lot to learn myself. So thank you so much for generously sharing. But yeah, we'll see everyone back at 3:30. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for your interest. Yep.
Bye, Lise.